Scholars of the Second Temple period have noticed, because it's kind of hard to miss, that there seems to be an uptick in interest when it comes to angels, again, members of the heavenly host, both the good guys and the bad guys in the Second Temple period. For instance, in the Old Testament, you only get angels that get names 2 times, like a proper name. In the Second Temple literature, that just sort of blows up. I mean, there are lots of named angels, named entities. And so scholars look at that and think, well, there must be a reason for that. They seem to be more interested in this. Why is this sort of thing happening? And honestly, to be blunt about it, basically they're just guesses. Everybody's just sort of guessing as to why this is. Some will say, well, there's a greater interest in angels because the Jewish community of the intertestamental period just viewed God or felt that God was more distant or remote. And they speculate that what we mean by that is that God was sort of disconnecting himself a little bit because the community is still sort of in exile anyway because 10 of the tribes are still missing. And it's like saying that God is sort of trying to decide whether he's still interested in working his plan again. But that's actually the kind of thing that people will say because they're saying, look, God is, to these people, less interested and less active, and he's sort of using the lesser members of his heavenly host to do things that he might have done in the Old Testament. And that shows that these people are thinking that God doesn't quite really want to buddy up with us anymore, and so he's assigning these tasks to lesser beings, intermediary. He doesn't want to mess with the riffraff so much. That theological speculation sort of has won the day in academia. Now, it is sort of fair that if you have this intertestamental period, there is still a sense of being in exile. We even get that in the New Testament. That much is fair. There is a sense that God isn't sort of directly visiting people anymore. Like you don't see the angel of the Lord. You don't have these things. I don't think we can draw any firm conclusions about why things get written the way they get written in this area. Yes, it could reflect kind of a woe is me or I wonder if God still likes us or if God is still upset with this kind of thing, that people aren't sort of personalizing the relationship between God and Israel so much anymore. That's all going to change dramatically, of course, with the New Testament. And so since I do view the New Testament as something different than this other literature, I think the very least we can say is that God was still interested. He's still, working a plan. The plan is still in effect, but that doesn't mean that God has to keep prompting people to write about it. Okay? So again, I tend to be one that doesn't care to speculate too much on that, but you do see an uptick in angel activity in the period. It's fair to say there's an uptick in literary output in the Second Temple period that concerns angels. Enoch is the big example. Now, Enoch is an apocalyptic text. One of the reasons why for that book and books like it that are in that same genre, that we get more angel activity is actually because of the Old Testament. Because the Old Testament prophecies of the day of the Lord include descriptions of angels, the angel armies coming with the Lord at the day of the Lord, at the end of days, and all this sort of stuff. And so in a text like 1st Enoch that is very apocalyptic in nature, Enoch sort of tries to explain the course of human history and what's going to happen at the end of days. The righteous are going to go here, the wicked are going to be punished. And so there's this depiction of this kind of time period. And so it would be very natural to give the reader a heavy dose of angel stuff because of the way this period, this prophetic period, this eschatological period is described in the Old Testament. So that kind of explains for that genre what's going on. Now for books in the Second Temple period that aren't in that genre, you still have angels show up. They assist people here and there. It's not with the sort of frequency, again, that you might see in the biblical books, but it's still there. It doesn't entirely go away. It's still part of the picture. I think if we had the author or authors of Enoch, because it is something of a composite book, kind of like the Bible is. The Bible is actually a collection of different books. That they would say, look, our goal here is to have the wicked warned. What's interesting for our purposes here is that they link the reason why judgment is going to happen to earlier rebellions in the Old Testament. That's why the Watcher story is a big deal. It sort of frames the discussion for the mess that humanity's in and how God is going to just bring this whole thing to a close. So there is continuity of thought in that sense. But so the writers want people warned. They want people to repent. If you don't repent, here's your destiny. Here's the destiny of the righteous. Here's the destiny of everybody else. They also want to describe it in terms of the finality of the judgment of these supernatural beings as well. In other words, that's a way to say, there's coming a time when all of this evil, not just human failure and evil, but cosmic evil and chaos, is going to be done. It's going to be over with. So this is essentially why it gets classified as an apocalyptic text. It very much has the end of days in mind when the whole thing is consummated. One of the other trajectories, though, that's kind of interesting, like with the Dead Sea Scrolls in a number of texts, is that there's a very strong theology put forth that scholars refer to as the angelic priesthood. And you have a number of texts. The Shabbat, Shirot, the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice are probably the most prominent example, where the order of heaven not only should get mirrored on earth, but must be to preserve the fabric of the cosmos. There was the Qumran sect, whoever that was. The dominant opinion is that these are the Essenes. They believed it was their responsibility to maintain the cosmic order of the heavens on earth. And they would do this through ritual, not only in priestly stuff, but also in the observance of sacred calendar. And this really gets kind of esoteric, but really interesting. This group actually left the Jerusalem priesthood, what we would think of as the Pharisees and the Sadducees, okay, that whole bunch. They actually separated from them because they didn't like the calendar that the other side was using. The people at Qumran believed that everyone should be using a mathematical calendar, not an astronomical calendar, because the astronomical calendar was imperfect. Again, now we know that a year is 365 and a quarter days. Okay, so the typical Jewish community would have been using a lunar calendar. 12 times 30 is 360, so 360 days in a year. They would add 5 to make it 365, but they wouldn't add the quarter. So periodically they'd have to add an extra month. And the Jewish calendar still today does this. This is why the date of Passover varies. It depends on when the extra month gets added and all this lunar cycle stuff. And the Essenes looked at that and they're saying, that's ridiculous. You have to contrive this calendar. What you should be doing is you should be looking at the first day of creation, the first day that time and timekeeping became a possibility was day 4 of Genesis. So that is day 1 in their calendar. They said if you just do everything on a specifically mathematically defined calendar of 360 days, and then you add a day between each quadrant of 90, then every Sabbath occurs on the same day of every year. Every sacred feast occurs on the same day in every year. The events of the Old Testament never occur on Sabbaths, so people don't work. They had a mathematically precise, beautiful, perfect calendar, and they believed that reflected the mind of God because God is perfect. And so since you're not doing that calendar, we're out of here. And they went out in the desert, and they, without a temple, went through all the temple stuff. They did all the ceremonies, they're doing all the festivals and all the rituals because they believed that this is what's happening in heaven. This is how the seasons pass. This is how the days and the nights function. And so we on earth need to be in total sync with heaven. And so for that reason, you get a lot of angel literature. because there were people in the Jewish community, this one particular sect, that believed the entire cosmos essentially hangs on us being in sync with them. I actually do think the angelic liturgy stuff is important because we do have New Testament theology about us becoming council members. We do have as in heaven, so on earth thinking. I mean, maybe not to this degree, but we do have this symbiotic sort of thing going on, that we are the earthly representation of the heavenly host, the heavenly bureaucracy. It's just the Essenes really just sort of took it to the nth degree and went out in the desert and pretended to have a temple. Part of the book of Enoch that, again, people find either really odd or really interesting is something known as the animal apocalypse. Now, this is an allegory where the characters of the Genesis 6 episode and the Deuteronomy 32 worldview thing, again, that rebellion, really the history of Israel, both in primeval days and moving forward, is retold with certain animals taking the place of certain characters. It's another retelling, just in a different form, of this whole story about why the world is the mess that it is. You can tell that they're tracking on the rebellion themes because they're doing an allegory on the Genesis 6 episode, which they take very seriously. And the whole situation about the nations of the earth being sheep with false shepherds, and the false shepherds need to be replaced by the great shepherd. It has this New Testament feel to it. And so scholars have sort of taken note of this and seen that, you know what, they're doing theology on the basis of a set of conditions in the Old Testament, and that's what the New Testament is doing too. And sometimes the language is really close to how they're envisioning this, how they're talking about it.